In the rolling hills of Wyoming, where success is measured by the size of your spread and the respect in folks' voices when they speak your name, Jackson Cole had it all. The richest rancher in 3 counties, with cattle that stretched to the horizon and a reputation that opened every door in town. But behind the polished boots and confident handshake lived a man carrying wounds that money couldn't heal and time couldn't fade. For 15 years, he'd built walls higher than his barn and thicker than his wallet, keeping everyone at a safe distance from the truth he couldn't bear to face. Then, one autumn morning, a girl with worn-out shoes and eyes full of kindness stepped off the bus with nothing but hope in her heart and healing in her gentle ways. Could someone so simple unlock the pain that wealth and status had only buried deeper? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cole Ranch as Jackson stood on his wraparound porch, coffee steaming in his weathered hands. At 52, he commanded respect from every corner of Sweetwater County, his name synonymous with success and shrewd business sense. The ranch sprawled across 30,000 acres of prime Wyoming grassland, home to the finest Black Angus cattle this side of the Continental Divide. His great-grandfather's gilded spurs hung in a place of honor above the stone fireplace, passed down through 3 generations of Cole men who'd built this empire from nothing but determination and Wyoming grit. The ranch house itself told the story of accumulated wealth, native stone and timber construction that had cost more than most folks saw in a lifetime, with hand-carved beams imported from Montana and windows that framed the Teton Range like living paintings. Every detail spoke of money thoughtfully spent, from the custom leather furniture to the Persian rugs that warmed the hardwood floors. Yet for all its grandeur, the house felt more like a monument than a home, impeccably maintained but lacking the warmth that comes from shared laughter and easy conversation. "Morning, boss," called Tommy Hendricks, Jackson's foreman for the past decade. A lean man with sun-weathered skin and kind eyes, Tommy had earned Jackson's trust through steady competence and an understanding that some subjects were never discussed. He approached the porch with the easy stride of a man comfortable in his boots hat tilted at the perfect angle that spoke of a lifetime spent under the Wyoming sky. "Stock report?" Jackson asked, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard the first time. "Looking good. Had Dr. Martinez out yesterday for the quarterly health check. She says we've got the healthiest herd in 3 counties. Tommy paused, studying his boss's profile. "You eaten anything this morning?" Rosa left some of her famous biscuits in the kitchen before she headed home. Rosa Delgado had been Jackson's housekeeper and cook for 8 years, a grandmother whose gentle persistence had worn down even Jackson's most stubborn defenses. She worried about him like family, often leaving extra portions and notes reminding him to eat. Her presence brought the only real warmth to the big house, though Jackson maintained his careful distance even with her maternal care. "I'll get something later," Jackson replied, the same response he'd given countless mornings. Food held little interest for him beyond basic sustenance, another symptom of a life lived in careful isolation. Tommy nodded, recognizing the futility of pushing further. "Got the Henderson contract to review when you're ready. They're eager to finalize the winter feed agreement." Jackson's business acumen was legendary throughout the region. He'd turned his grandfather's modest cattle operation into a diversified empire that included land development, mineral rights, and strategic partnerships with agricultural corporations. His office in town maintained files on every significant business venture within 200 miles, and his advice was sought by ranchers and investors alike. Yet success had come at a price that few understood. The sound of gravel crunching under tires announced the arrival of Martha Colson, Jackson's business partner and the closest thing he had to a friend. A formidable woman in her 60s, Martha owned the largest real estate firm in the county, and shared Jackson's gift for turning opportunity into profit. She climbed out of her pristine SUV with the energy of someone half her age, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the early hour. "Jackson. Cole, you look like a man who needs a proper breakfast," she called out, her voice carrying the affection of long friendship. "I swear you're getting thinner every time I see you." "Good morning to you too, Martha," Jackson replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. Martha was one of the few people who could tease him without triggering his defensive walls. "I brought the Riverside development proposals," she said, climbing the porch steps with a briefcase in hand. "Though I suspect you've already read every word twice." Jackson had indeed studied the documents thoroughly. The Riverside project represented a significant expansion of their joint ventures, transforming 2,000 acres of ranch land into a luxury residential community. It was the kind of deal that would cement his already considerable wealth, yet he found himself strangely unmoved by the prospect. They settled into comfortable chairs on the porch, surrounded by the quiet efficiency of ranch life. In the distance, horses grazed in irrigated pastures, their sleek coats gleaming in the morning light. The automatic sprinkler systems maintained emerald green fields that contrasted beautifully with the golden prairie grass beyond. Everything spoke of careful planning and substantial investment, a testament to Jackson's unwavering attention to detail. "You seem distant lately," Martha observed, her shrewd eyes studying his face. "More than usual, I mean." Jackson's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his coffee cup. These moments of personal inquiry made him uncomfortable, threatening the careful equilibrium he'd spent years constructing. "Just thinking about the quarterly reports." Martha wasn't fooled, but she'd learned to respect his boundaries. Their friendship had developed over years of successful business partnerships built on mutual respect and shared values. She understood that Jackson carried pain from his past, though he'd never shared the details. His late wife, Sarah, had been her friend too, and Martha remembered the vibrant young man Jackson had been before tragedy reshaped him into someone harder and more guarded. "The town's growing," she said, changing the subject to safer ground. "Young families moving in, new businesses opening. Remember when Main Street was half-empty storefronts?" Jackson nodded, remembering a time when he'd cared about such things. In his younger days, he'd been actively involved in community development, serving on boards and committees, investing in local businesses not just for profit, but from genuine civic pride. Those days felt like someone else's memories now, viewed through the filter of accumulated sorrow. The conversation was interrupted by the approach of Dr. Sarah Martinez, the veterinarian who'd become an integral part of the ranch's operation. A woman in her 40s with an easy smile and competent manner, she'd earned Jackson's respect through her dedication to animal welfare and her refusal to be intimidated by his sometimes brusque demeanor. "Morning, Jackson, Martha," she called out, wiping her hands on a towel. "Just finished with the breeding stock. You've got some impressive genetics in that herd." "Appreciate the thoroughness, Doc," Jackson replied, genuinely grateful for her expertise. His relationship with Dr. Martinez was purely professional, but it represented one of the few connections in his life built on mutual respect rather than business necessity. As the morning progressed, Jackson moved through his familiar routines with the precision of a man who'd structured his life to avoid unpredictability. He reviewed financial statements, consulted with his investment advisor in Denver, and approved expenditures for ranch improvements. Every decision was made with careful consideration, every dollar accounted for and purposefully spent. Yet beneath the surface of his controlled existence, something stirred, a restlessness that no amount of success could quiet. 15 years of building wealth and maintaining distance had created a life of impressive achievement and profound loneliness. He'd become a master at avoiding the deeper questions about purpose and connection, focusing instead on measurable goals and quantifiable success. The afternoon brought its own familiar rhythm. Jackson rode the ranch's boundaries on his favorite horse, a magnificent bay gelding named Thunder, who'd been his constant companion for 7 years. These solitary rides provided the closest thing to peace he'd found since his world collapsed. The vast landscape offering perspective that his carefully controlled environment couldn't provide. As evening approached, Jackson stood once again on his porch, watching the sun set behind the Tetons. The golden light painted the landscape in warm hues, transforming the ordinary into something beautiful. Yet even this daily spectacle failed to penetrate the careful numbness he'd cultivated as protection against feeling too much. The big house waited behind him, perfectly appointed and utterly empty of the laughter and love that might have made it a true home. Tomorrow would bring another day of successful management and profitable decisions, another 24 hours of living life on the surface while keeping his deepest self locked away, like his great-grandfather's spurs. Beautiful, valuable, and untouched by daily use. Jackson Cole had everything a man could want, except the one thing that might make it all worthwhile. Someone who could see past the wealth and success to the wounded heart he'd spent 15 years learning to protect. The Greyhound bus wheezed to a stop at the weathered station on Main Street, its brakes hissing like a tired old horse. Through the dust-streaked window, Emma Hartwell clutched a faded bus ticket that had carried her 800 miles from Kansas, the paper soft from nervous handling during the long journey west. At 28, she possessed the kind of understated beauty that revealed itself slowly, gentle brown eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's heart, auburn hair that caught sunlight like copper wire, and a smile that made strangers feel like old friends. Her entire life fit into a battered canvas suitcase and a cloth bag containing her most precious possession, a hand-carved wooden cross her father had made during his final illness. The cross bore the smooth patina of countless worried fingers, a testament to faith tested by loss and strengthened by quiet acceptance. Emma had nothing in the way of money or connections, but she carried something rarer, an unshakable belief that kindness could heal even the deepest wounds. "End of the line, miss," the driver called back, his voice kind but tired from the long haul. Emma gathered her courage along with her belongings, stepping onto the cracked sidewalk of a town that looked like it had been carved from the landscape itself. Sweetwater's Main Street stretched before her like a scene from an old Western movie, complete with hitching posts that still saw occasional use and storefronts that had weathered decades of Wyoming winters. The mountains rose in the distance like ancient guardians, their peaks touched with early snow that promised winter's approach. She'd come here following nothing more than instinct and a classified ad she'd seen in a farming journal. Ranch work available. Experience preferred but not required. Housing provided for the right person. The phone number had connected her to a gruff voice that asked few questions and offered fewer details, but something in the tone suggested loneliness masquerading as business efficiency. The Cole Ranch lay 15 miles outside town, accessible by a gravel road that wound through grassland so vast it made Emma's breath catch in her throat. She'd managed to catch a ride with a local feed delivery truck, the driver, a weathered man named Pete, curious about the young woman with the soft Kansas accent who was heading to the richest spread in the county. Jackson Cole's a fair man, Pete had offered during the dusty ride. Pays well, treats his people right, but he keeps to himself, if you know what I mean. Been that way for years now. Emma had nodded, sensing stories behind the careful words. Her own experience with loss had taught her that grief wore many faces, and sometimes the most successful people carried the heaviest burdens. The ranch entrance was marked by a wrought iron gate bearing the Cole family brand, the metalwork speaking of permanence and pride. The main house rose from the landscape like something from a magazine, all native stone and timber that seemed to grow from the earth itself. Emma felt a moment of doubt as she walked up the circular drive. What business did a girl with holes in her shoes have at a place like this? Jackson Cole emerged from the stables as she approached, and Emma's first impression was of contained power and careful distance. He was tall and lean, with silver threading through dark hair, and eyes the color of winter sky. His clothes were expensive but practical, the kind of boots that cost more than Emma had earned in her last month of work, but worn by someone who actually used them for their intended purpose. "You, the girl who called about the job?" His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but Emma detected something else underneath, a weariness that spoke of carrying heavy loads alone. "Yes, sir, Emma Hartwell." She extended her hand with a confidence that belied her nervousness. His handshake was firm and brief, the calluses on his palm telling of honest work despite obvious wealth. Jackson found himself momentarily unsettled by her direct gaze and genuine smile. Most people either deferred to his money or angled for some advantage, but Emma looked at him as simply a person who might need help. It had been years since anyone had looked at him that way. "Experience with cattle?" he asked, falling back on familiar territory. "Some. My grandfather raised beef cattle in Kansas. Nothing like this," she gestured toward the pristine facilities. "But I know my way around livestock." Jackson studied her worn clothes and battered suitcase, wondering what circumstances had brought her so far from home with so little. Something in her manner suggested resilience rather than desperation, strength rather than neediness. "Housings. In the bunkhouse," he said finally. "Meals with the hands. Pays $300 a week plus room and board." Emma's relief was carefully contained but visible to someone who knew how to look. "That's generous, Mr. Cole. Work starts at sunrise. You'll be helping with general ranch duties, some cooking for the crew. Rosa handles the main house." He paused, studying her face. "You sure about this? Ranch work's hard and we're heading into winter." "I'm sure," Emma said, her voice carrying quiet conviction. "I believe I'm supposed to be here." The simple statement hung in the air between them, and Jackson felt an unfamiliar stirring, something that might have been hope if he'd allowed himself to recognize it. Instead, he nodded curtly and turned toward the stables. "Tommy will show. You around? He's the foreman." As he walked away, Jackson found his thoughts lingering on the young woman with the gentle eyes and sure handshake. There had been something almost familiar about her, as if she carried the memory of someone he'd once known, someone from a time when he'd been capable of trust and tenderness. Emma settled into the small but clean room in the bunkhouse, unpacking her few belongings with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make any space feel like home. The window looked out over pastures where horses grazed in the golden afternoon light, and she felt something settle in her chest, a sense of belonging she hadn't experienced since her father's death 6 months earlier. Tommy Hendricks proved to be a patient teacher, showing Emma the routines and rhythms of ranch life. She demonstrated a natural affinity for the animals, approaching the horses with the quiet confidence that comes from genuine affection rather than learned technique. The cattle responded to her gentle manner, and even the barn cats seemed drawn to her peaceful presence. "You've done this before," Tommy observed as Emma helped him distribute feed. "Different scale, but yes. Animals don't lie about what they need." Emma scratched behind the ears of a curious calf. People could learn from that. That evening, as Emma helped prepare dinner for the ranch hands, she found herself glancing toward the main house where Jackson Cole ate alone. The contrast struck her as particularly sad, surrounded by abundance, but isolated from the simple pleasure of shared meals and easy conversation. Over the following days, Emma began to understand the careful choreography of ranch life. She learned which horses preferred gentle handling and which needed firm guidance, discovered the personalities of the cattle and the best methods for managing them. Her competence earned quick acceptance from the other hands, but it was her kindness that made them protective of her. Jackson found himself watching Emma work, drawn by her natural grace and quiet efficiency. She approached every task with the same gentle thoroughness, whether feeding cattle or mending tack. More disturbing to his carefully maintained equilibrium was the way she looked at him, not with the deference he'd grown accustomed to, but with the same compassionate attention she gave the animals in her care, One morning, while Emma was helping with the horses, Jackson's prize mare became spooked by a loose gate banging in the wind. The animal reared and struck out, sending the other handlers scrambling for safety. Emma stepped forward without hesitation, her voice low and soothing as she approached the frightened horse. "Easy, beautiful," she murmured, her movements slow and deliberate. "Nobody's going to hurt you." Jackson watched in fascination as the mare responded to Emma's calm presence, the animal's fear dissolving under the influence of her gentle confidence. Within minutes, Emma had the horse settled and comfortable, accepting a halter as if the panic had never occurred. "How did you do that?" Tommy asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. Emma shrugged, stroking the mare's neck. She just needed someone to listen to her fear instead of fighting it. The words hit Jackson with unexpected force, resonating in places he'd thought permanently sealed. As he walked back to the house, he found himself wondering if Emma's gift for healing extended beyond frightened animals to wounded souls who'd forgotten how to trust. 2 weeks into Emma's stay at the Cole Ranch, the rhythm of her presence had begun to weave itself into the fabric of daily life. She rose before dawn, joining Tommy and the other hands for coffee so strong it could wake the dead, her soft laughter becoming a familiar sound in the pre-sunrise darkness. The wooden cross her father had carved remained her only treasure, worn, smooth by worried fingers during sleepless nights when grief threatened to overwhelm her faith. Emma's integration into ranch life revealed a competence that surprised even Tommy. She possessed an intuitive understanding of cattle behavior that couldn't be taught, sensing when a steer was feeling poorly before symptoms became obvious, or knowing which cow was ready to calve simply by watching her restless movement in the pasture. Her gentle hands could calm the most fractious horse, and she'd already earned the respect of the ranch dogs, who followed her with the devoted attention usually reserved for their primary handlers. "Girl's got a gift," observed Miguel Santos, a ranch hand who'd worked cattle for 30 years. "Animals trust her like she speaks their language." Jackson found himself creating excuses to visit the areas where Emma worked, drawn by a curiosity he couldn't quite name. He watched from a distance as she helped Tommy repair fence line, her movements economical and sure despite her slight build. When she spoke to the other hands, her voice carried genuine interest in their stories and concerns, transforming routine work into something approaching fellowship. One morning, while checking on the breeding stock, Jackson encountered Emma sitting on a fence rail, speaking softly to a cow who'd lost her calf the previous week. The animal stood close to the fence, clearly finding comfort in Emma's presence. "She's grieving," Emma said without looking up, somehow sensing Jackson's approach. "Lost her baby 3 days ago, and she keeps calling for him." Jackson felt an unexpected tightness in his chest. He'd dealt with livestock losses countless times, treating them as unavoidable costs of ranching. But Emma's observation forced him to see the cow's behavior through different eyes, not as an inconvenience to be managed, but as genuine sorrow to be acknowledged. "Nature of the business," he said, his voice more brusque than intended. Emma turned to study his face with those perceptive brown eyes. "Doesn't make it hurt less, for her or for us." The simple statement hung between them, loaded with meaning Jackson wasn't prepared to explore. He found himself remembering Sarah's excitement about their unborn child, the way she'd talked to her growing belly as if the baby could already hear her voice. The memory brought its familiar spike of pain, and he turned away before Emma could. Read too much in his expression. "Tommy needs help moving the herd to the south pasture," he said, retreating to safer ground. Emma nodded, accepting his deflection with a grace that somehow made it more obvious. As she climbed down from the fence, Jackson caught himself watching the fluid way she moved, the unconscious elegance that had nothing to do with money or training and everything to do with someone comfortable in her own skin. That evening, Emma joined the ranch hands for dinner in the bunkhouse kitchen, a tradition that had evolved naturally from her first night. She'd quietly taken over much of the cooking, transforming simple ingredients into meals that reminded the men of home and family. Tonight's dinner of beef stew and cornbread filled the kitchen with warmth and the kind of easy conversation that comes from shared work and mutual respect. "Emma, you're spoiling us," said Pete Morrison, the youngest of the hands. "Rosa's going to be jealous when she tastes your cooking." Emma smiled, but Jackson noticed she deflected personal compliments with the same gentle efficiency she applied to everything else. "It's just following recipes my grandmother taught me. Nothing special. Special's in the caring, not the cooking," observed Carlos Mendez, an older hand whose weathered face held decades of cowboy wisdom. "Food tastes better when it's made with affection." Through the kitchen window, Emma could see lights in the main house where Jackson ate his solitary dinners. The contrast struck her as unnecessarily sad. All that wealth and success, but no one to share it with. She'd grown up in modest circumstances, but her family's table had always been a place of connection and storytelling, where the day's troubles could be set aside in favor of laughter and belonging. Jackson, meanwhile, sat in his formal dining room, mechanically eating the excellent meal Rosa had prepared before leaving for her own family. The silence felt heavier lately, particularly when he could hear the distant sound of laughter from the bunkhouse. He'd trained himself not to think about what he was missing, but Emma's presence had somehow made his isolation more noticeable. The following morning brought unseasonably warm weather, and Emma volunteered to help with the seasonal task of checking and repairing water lines in the far pastures. Jackson found himself assigned to the same crew, though he could have easily delegated the work to Tommy. Something about Emma's steady presence made even routine maintenance feel less burdensome. Working together in comfortable silence, Jackson found his carefully maintained walls beginning to show hairline cracks. Emma didn't push for conversation, but when she did speak, her observations carried the kind of wisdom that comes from paying attention to life's smaller details. "This land must have been beautiful when your family first settled here," she said, during a break, shading her eyes to look across the vast expanse of grassland. "My great-grandfather said it reminded him of paradise," Jackson replied, surprised by his willingness to share even that small piece of family history. "Course, he said that before he'd spent a winter here." Emma's gentle laugh was like sunlight breaking through clouds. "I imagine paradise comes with its own challenges. Makes you appreciate it more, maybe." Jackson felt something stir in response to her easy acceptance of both beauty and hardship. Most people in his current circle focused exclusively on the financial aspects of the land, its value, development potential, or investment returns. Emma saw it as his ancestors had, as something both beautiful and demanding, worthy of respect rather than simply exploitation. As they worked, Jackson found himself stealing glances at Emma's profile, noting the way concentration softened her features and how her competent hands handled tools with the same gentle confidence she showed with animals. When she caught him looking, instead of the uncomfortable awareness he'd expected, she simply smiled, an expression so genuinely warm it bypassed his intellectual defenses and struck directly at carefully buried emotions. "You're different from what I expected," Emma said as they packed up their tools. "What did you expect?" Jackson asked, genuinely curious. Emma considered the question seriously. "Someone harder, I think. More untouchable. But you care about this place the way other people care about family." The observation was uncomfortably accurate. Jackson had poured his capacity for love into the land itself, finding in its rhythms and demands a way to channel emotions he couldn't safely direct toward people. Emma had seen through his defensive distance to recognize the passion he'd redirected into soil and livestock and seasonal cycles. That evening, Jackson found himself walking past the bunkhouse during dinner, drawn by the sound of Emma's voice, as she told some story that had the men laughing with genuine delight. Through the lit windows, he could see her animated gestures and bright eyes, the way she drew people into the warmth of her attention. For just a moment, he allowed himself to imagine what it might feel like to be included in that circle of easy affection. The thought scared him more than he cared to admit. 15 years of careful isolation had created a life of predictable safety, but Emma's presence made that safety feel increasingly like a prison of his own making. October's crisp evenings brought the kind of weather that made outdoor work a pleasure rather than a chore. Emma had been at the Cole Ranch for nearly a month, and her presence had begun to change the atmosphere in ways both subtle and profound. The ranch hands worked with more energy, their conversations peppered with the kind of gentle teasing that spoke of genuine affection for their newest member. Even the animals seemed more settled, responding to Emma's calm confidence with trust that extended beyond their immediate interactions with her. Jackson kept a locked cedar box in his study, hidden behind leather-bound books that hadn't been opened in years. The box contained remnants of his former life: wedding photos, Sarah's favorite earrings, the ultrasound image of their unborn son that he'd carried in his wallet until the paper began to disintegrate. These mementos remained carefully sealed, away, too painful to examine but too precious to discard. Like his heart itself, the evening ritual of checking livestock had become Jackson's excuse for encountering Emma during her own rounds. She moved through the barns with practiced efficiency, her presence somehow transforming routine tasks into moments of quiet meditation. Tonight, she was in the horse barn, brushing down Thunder, Jackson's bay gelding who had inexplicably taken to her despite his usual wariness around strangers. "He's a beautiful animal," Emma said, not looking up from her work as Jackson approached. "Got some Arabian in him, I'd guess." "Quarter horse and Arabian," Jackson confirmed, surprised by her accurate assessment. "Good eye." Emma's hands continued their steady rhythm, the brush revealing Thunder's gleaming coat. "My grandfather always said you could tell a lot about a person by how their horses treated strangers. This one's cautious, but not afraid. Means he's been handled with firmness, but never cruelty." The observation carried implicit praise that Jackson found himself appreciating more than expected. He'd trained Thunder himself, spending countless hours building the trust that showed in the horse's relaxed posture under Emma's care. "You know horses?" Jackson said, settling against the stall door with an ease that surprised them both. "Some. My grandfather had a small stable. Nothing fancy, but honest horses that earned their keep." Emma's voice carried the warm affection reserved for cherished memories. "He used to say that horses were God's way of teaching people about partnership. Can't force them into cooperation, have to earn it." Jackson found himself studying Emma's profile in the barn's golden light, noting the small smile that played at the corners of her mouth as she worked. There was something deeply peaceful about watching her gentle efficiency, the way she approached every task as if it mattered not just for its completion, but for the care it represented. "Tell me about your grandfather," he said, the words emerging. Before his cautious mind could intervene, Emma's hands paused briefly before resuming their steady motion. "He was a good man who never had much but always found ways to share what he had. Taught me that wealth isn't about what you own, but about how much love you can give away without depleting yourself." The simple philosophy hung between them, challenging. Assumptions Jackson had spent years building about success and protection. He'd accumulated wealth as a form of armor, surrounding himself with material security that couldn't be taken away the way people could. Emma's perspective suggested an entirely different approach to life's uncertainties. "Sounds like wise counsel," Jackson said carefully. "He was the wisest person I ever knew. Died when I was 16, but his lessons stayed with me." Emma's voice carried quiet sadness without self-pity. "Lost my parents in a car accident 5 years later, then my father to cancer this past spring. Grandfather's wisdom helped me understand that grief is love with nowhere to go. The trick is finding new places to put it." Jackson felt his breath catch as Emma's words struck directly at truths he'd spent 15 years avoiding. Her matter-of-fact acceptance of multiple losses put his own carefully guarded pain into a different perspective. Not unique suffering that justified isolation, but part of the human experience that could either diminish or deepen one's capacity. For connection. I'm sorry for your losses, he said, the inadequate words carrying more genuine feeling than he'd expressed in years. Emma turned to meet his eyes, her expression gentle but direct. Thank you, but I've learned that sorrow shared becomes more bearable, while joy shared becomes larger. Isolation might feel safer, but it makes everything smaller. The observation felt like a diagnosis delivered with surgical precision but infinite. Compassion. Jackson recognized himself in her description of isolation's false safety, though he wasn't ready to acknowledge the recognition aloud. Their conversation was interrupted by Tommy's approach, his boots announcing his presence on the barn's wooden floor. Evening, boss. Emma, just checking the breeding stock before calling it a day. Jackson nodded, grateful for the interruption that allowed him to step back from emotional territory that felt simultaneously dangerous and compelling. As Tommy busied himself with his rounds, Jackson found himself reluctant to leave Emma's peaceful presence. The town's harvest festival is next weekend, Emma said, returning to her work with Thunder. Some of the hands mentioned it. Sounds like quite a celebration. Jackson felt familiar walls rising at the mention of community events. The Harvest Festival had once been something he and Sarah looked forward to each year, a chance to reconnect with neighbors and celebrate another successful season. Since her death, he'd made excuses to avoid such gatherings, unable to bear the weight of sympathetic looks and carefully worded condolences. Used to be, he said, his tone carrying finality. Emma heard the dismissal, but chose to address it indirectly. Tommy says the whole county comes together. Music, dancing, food booths, the kind of thing that reminds people why they choose to live in places like this. If you want to go, I'm sure one of the hands would drive you to town, Jackson offered, deflecting her implicit invitation. Emma finished with Thunder and turned to face Jackson fully, her expression thoughtful but not judgmental. Sometimes the things we used to love become painful because they remind us of what we've lost. But avoiding them means the loss wins twice, once when it happens, and again every time we let it stop us from living. Jackson felt the truth of her words like a physical weight in his chest. Every community event he'd avoided, every friendship he'd allowed to wither, every moment of potential joy he'd rejected in favor of safe numbness. Emma was right that his losses had claimed far more than their original toll. It's complicated, he said finally, the words feeling insufficient even as he spoke them. Most worthwhile things are, Emma replied with gentle understanding, but complicated doesn't have to mean impossible. As Jackson walked back to the main house that evening, Emma's words echoed in his mind with uncomfortable persistence. For 15 years, he'd chosen the certainty of controlled isolation over the risk of renewed connection. But Emma's presence was making that choice feel less like wisdom and more like cowardice, a realization that both terrified and intrigued him in equal measure. The first snow of the season arrived earlier than expected, dusting the mountains with pristine white and transforming the ranch into a landscape of stark beauty. Emma stood at her bunkhouse window watching the flakes drift past, each one catching the morning light like tiny stars falling to earth. In her hand, she held a pressed wildflower she'd discovered marking a page in one of the ranch's old veterinary manuals, a delicate bloom that someone had carefully preserved between sheets of wax paper years ago. The flower spoke of a gentler time when someone at the ranch had noticed beauty worth saving in something as simple as a prairie blossom. Emma wondered who had pressed it there, and whether that person still lived on the ranch or had moved on, leaving only this small testament to their capacity for wonder. Jackson's transformation over the past weeks had been subtle but unmistakable. Where once he'd moved through ranch routines with mechanical efficiency, now he seemed more present, more aware of the details that made each day unique. Emma had noticed him pausing to watch sunrise, paint the mountains, or stopping to scratch the ears of a friendly calf instead of simply walking past. These small moments of connection suggested a man remembering how to see beauty in everyday experiences. This morning's snow had created perfect conditions for moving the cattle to winter pastures, a complex operation that required careful coordination and experienced hands. Emma had volunteered to help despite the challenging weather, and Jackson found himself assigning her to work alongside him rather than with the other hands, a decision he justified as practical but knew had deeper motivations. "Ever worked cattle in snow?" Jackson asked as they rode toward the south pasture, their horses' breath creating small clouds in the crisp air. "Some. Kansas winters aren't quite this beautiful, but we had our share of cold." Emma's voice carried the contentment of someone truly comfortable in the saddle. "There's something peaceful about snow work. Makes everything quieter, more focused." Jackson nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Snow had a way of muffling unnecessary sounds while amplifying the essential ones, the soft thud of hooves. On snow-packed ground, the gentle lowing of cattle moving in formation, the creaking of leather that spoke of honest work being done with proper tools. Working together to guide the herd through increasingly deep snow, Jackson found himself appreciating Emma's instinctive understanding of cattle psychology. She positioned herself exactly where pressure was needed to keep the herd moving without creating panic. Her movements so natural they seemed choreographed with the animals themselves. "You've got real talent for this," Jackson said during a brief, and paused to rest the horses. Emma's cheeks were flushed from cold and exertion, making her brown eyes seem even warmer by contrast. Animals respond to intention more than technique. They can tell when someone genuinely cares about their well-being versus just trying to control them. The observation carried implications that extended beyond cattle management, and Jackson felt the familiar stirring of recognition that accompanied Emma's insights. She had a gift for expressing complex truths in simple language, making profound concepts accessible without diminishing their impact. As they worked through the morning, Jackson found himself sharing stories about the ranch's history, how his great-grandfather had chosen this particular valley for its natural windbreaks and year-round water sources, how 3 generations of Coles had shaped the land while being shaped by it in return. The words came easier than expected, as if Emma's genuine interest drew memories to the surface that had been buried under years of purely business-focused thinking. "Your family built something lasting here," Emma said, as they paused on a ridge, overlooking the winter pastures where the cattle were settling into their new environment. "Not just successful, but meaningful. That's rarer than people think." Jackson studied the landscape that had defined his family's legacy for over a century, seeing it through Emma's appreciative eyes. The snow-covered fields and distant mountains created a vista of timeless beauty, reminding him why his ancestors had been willing to risk everything for the chance to build something permanent in this challenging but magnificent place. "Sometimes I wonder what they'd think of what it's become," Jackson said, his voice carrying uncharacteristic vulnerability. "All the business deals and investment strategies. Great-grandfather came here with a few head of cattle and a dream. Now it's quarterly reports and development proposals." Emma considered his words carefully before responding. "Success can change the shape of a dream without changing its heart. Your great-grandfather wanted to build something that would last, provide for his family, be worthy of this beautiful land. Seems to me you've honored that, even if the methods are different." Her perspective offered a way of viewing his life's work that bridged the gap between ancestral dreams and contemporary realities. Instead of betraying his family's legacy through modernization and expansion, perhaps he'd simply adapted their core values to changing circumstances. The afternoon brought unexpected challenges when a section of the winter fence proved less secure than anticipated, requiring immediate repairs to prevent cattle from wandering into less protected areas. Working together to replace damaged posts and restring wire, Jackson and Emma fell into the kind of easy cooperation that develops between people who trust each other's competence. "Hand me that post hole digger," Emma said, pointing to a tool just beyond her reach. Jackson passed the heavy implement, their gloved hands brushing briefly in the exchange. Even through thick leather, the contact sent an unexpected jolt of awareness through him, a reminder that his attraction to Emma extended far beyond respect for her ranching skills. Emma seemed equally affected by the brief touch, her cheeks flushing with something that had nothing to do with cold weather. For a moment, they stood close enough to share breath in the frigid air, the space between them charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to acknowledge. "We should finish this before the light fails," Emma said softly, stepping back to safer distance. Jackson nodded, grateful for her wisdom even as part of him regretted the retreat. Physical attraction he could understand and manage, but Emma's effect on him went deeper. She made him want to be the man he'd been before grief taught him that. Love was too dangerous to risk. As evening approached and they completed the fence repairs, Jackson found himself reluctant to return to the main house and the solitary dinner that awaited him there. The day's shared work had created a sense of partnership that made his usual isolation feel particularly empty. "Emma," he said as they prepared to unsaddle their horses, "would you consider joining me for dinner tonight?" Rosa left a roast that's far too much for one person. The invitation surprised them both with its spontaneity, cutting through weeks of careful distance with an honesty that left Jackson feeling exposed. Emma's response would either validate the connection he'd begun to hope for or confirm that his feelings were one-sided. Emma's smile answered before her words did, warm and genuine and touched with something that might have been relief. "I'd like that very much, Jackson. Thank you." As they walked toward the main house together, the snow continued to fall around them like a benediction, transforming the familiar landscape into something magical and new. Jackson felt something that had been frozen for 15 years beginning to thaw. Dangerous but necessary as spring after the longest winter. The dinner invitation had seemed natural in the moment, born from a day of shared work and growing connection. But as Jackson prepared the main house for Emma's visit, familiar anxiety crept through his carefully maintained composure. He hadn't entertained a guest for dinner in over a decade, and the formal dining room that had hosted business associates and strategic partnerships suddenly felt cold and intimidating for the kind of evening he hoped to create. Instead, Jackson found himself setting the kitchen table, a more intimate space that retained the warmth of Rosa's daily presence. The kitchen had always been the heart of the house during his childhood, where his mother had taught him that food shared with care could heal both body and spirit. Tonight, he wanted to offer Emma more than mere sustenance. He wanted to give her a glimpse of the man he might still be beneath layers of protective distance. Emma arrived as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink that made the world look newly created. She changed from her work clothes into a simple dress the color of autumn leaves, her hair freed from its usual practical braid to fall in soft waves around her shoulders. The transformation reminded Jackson that beneath the competent ranch hand lived a woman of quiet beauty and natural grace. "Your home is beautiful," Emma said as Jackson helped her with her coat, her eyes taking in the stone fireplace, where flames danced behind wrought-iron screens. "It feels like it grew from the land itself." Jackson followed her appreciative gaze, seeing the familiar space through fresh eyes. The native stone walls and exposed timber beams created an atmosphere of rustic elegance, while family photographs and inherited furniture spoke of generations who had called this place home. For the first time in years, he felt proud of what his family had built rather than burdened by its maintenance. Among the family photographs on the mantel sat a child's drawing, carefully framed despite its amateur execution, a crayon rendering of a ranch house with stick-figure people and a bright yellow sun. Jackson had forgotten the drawing's existence until this moment, when Emma's presence seemed to illuminate corners of his life that had been darkened by willful neglect. "Who's the artist?" Emma asked, drawn to the childlike optimism captured in bold crayon strokes. Jackson felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. My nephew, Sarah's brother's boy. He was maybe 7 when he drew that. The words emerged, despite his usual reluctance to mention his late wife, as if Emma's gentle interest made such sharing feel safe rather than dangerous. Emma studied the drawing with genuine appreciation. Children see possibility where adults see problems. Look how happy those people look, how bright that sun shines. He captured something true about this place. Her observation reminded Jackson of a time when the ranch had indeed been filled with that kind of simple joy, when family gatherings brought laughter to every room, and the future stretched ahead full of promise rather than dread. Sarah had loved children's artwork, collecting their drawings and displaying them proudly as treasures worthy of admiration. Over Rosa's perfectly prepared roast beef and winter vegetables, Jackson found himself sharing stories he hadn't spoken aloud in years. He told Emma about learning to ride on his grandfather's gentle mare, about summer roundups that felt more like adventures than work, about the Christmas when his father had surprised him with a working miniature windmill that still stood in the garden outside. You had a good childhood, Emma observed, her voice carrying no envy despite her own early losses. I did. Makes the contrast harder sometimes. Jackson paused, surprised by his admission. When life was simpler, happiness seemed natural. Now it feels like something I have to remember how to do. Emma reached across the table to briefly touch his hand, the contact sending warmth through him that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with human connection. Happiness isn't something you do, Jackson. It's something you allow, like letting a flower bloom instead of trying to force it open. The metaphor resonated with truths Jackson was only beginning to understand. He'd spent 15 years trying to control his emotional responses, managing grief and joy with the same strategic thinking he applied to business decisions. Emma's presence suggested a different approach, one that required trust in natural processes rather than rigid management of outcomes. As they moved to the living room after dinner, Jackson found himself building a fire in the massive stone hearthlace, an activity he'd avoided for years because it reminded him too much of evenings spent with Sarah. But Emma's comfortable presence transformed the ritual from painful reminder into simple pleasure, the crackling flames creating an atmosphere of intimacy without pressure. Tell me about Kansas, Jackson said as they settled into comfortable chairs near the fire. What was your life like before you came here? Emma's expression grew thoughtful as she watched flames dance behind the screen. Smaller. Not better or worse, just smaller. I taught Sunday school at our little church, helped my father through his illness, worked part-time at the farm supply store. Good people, honest work. But I always felt like I was waiting for something, without knowing what. Jackson understood that sense of waiting, though his own had been shadowed by loss rather than illuminated by hope. What made you decide to leave? After Daddy died, I realized I'd been living someone else's version of my life. Not bad, but not truly mine either. Emma's voice carried quiet conviction. I prayed about it for weeks, and every time I opened my heart to guidance, I felt pulled west. When I saw the ad for ranch work, it felt like an answer to questions I hadn't known how to ask. The simple faith underlying Emma's decision-making process fascinated Jackson. He'd built his life around careful analysis and risk management, making decisions based on projected outcomes and statistical probabilities. Emma's willingness to follow intuition and spiritual guidance represented a courage he'd forgotten he once possessed. Do you ever doubt the choice? He asked. Emma's smile lit up her entire face. Every day for the first week. Then I met you and Tommy and the others, saw this beautiful land, felt how right it was to be here. Sometimes the biggest risks turn out to be the safest choices because they align with who we're meant to be. Jackson felt the truth of her words settling into places he'd kept carefully defended. His own biggest risk, loving Sarah, planning a future that seemed guaranteed, had led to devastating loss. But Emma's perspective suggested that perhaps the real danger lay not in loving again, but in refusing to let his heart heal enough to take that risk. As the evening progressed, their conversation flowed with the easy rhythm of two people discovering compatible minds and hearts. Emma shared stories of her grandfather's wisdom and her father's gentle strength, while Jackson found himself remembering aspects of his own character that had been buried under years of protective cynicism. In Emma's appreciative attention, he began to glimpse the man he might still become if he could find the courage to step beyond the safety of his emotional isolation. When Emma finally rose to leave, Jackson felt genuine regret that their time together was ending. At the door, they stood close enough to feel each other's warmth, the space between them charged with possibilities neither was quite ready to name. "Thank you for tonight," Emma said softly. "It was wonderful to see your home, to learn more about the man behind all that careful distance." Jackson felt his heart accelerate at her gentle directness. "Thank you for accepting. It's been a long time since this house felt like a home." Their eyes met and held, conveying messages that words might have made too dangerous. Jackson felt himself leaning slightly closer, drawn by the warmth in Emma's gaze and the possibility of connection he'd thought permanently lost. But years of caution reasserted themselves, and he stepped back before the moment could transform into something that might shatter his carefully rebuilt equilibrium. Emma seemed to understand his retreat without judgment, offering one of her gentle smiles that conveyed acceptance rather than disappointment. "Good night, Jackson, sweet dreams." As Jackson watched her walk back to the bunkhouse through the softly falling snow, he felt something fundamental shifting in his chest, a loosening of bonds he'd thought permanent, a stirring of hope he'd buried so deeply he'd forgotten its existence. For the first time in 15 years, the future seemed to hold possibilities more compelling than mere survival. The discovery came by accident, as truth often does when it has been carefully hidden for too long. Emma was helping Rosa organize Jackson's study, a task that involved moving boxes of old papers to make room for updated filing systems. As she lifted a particularly heavy box from behind the desk, the bottom gave way, spilling its contents across. The hardwood floor in a cascade of yellowed newspaper clippings, legal documents, and personal mementos. Rosa gasped and immediately began gathering the scattered papers, her weathered hands moving with the urgency of someone who understood that some secrets were not meant for public viewing. But it was too late. Emma's eyes had already found the newspaper clipping that would change everything between her and Jackson Cole. The headline was stark and unforgiving. "Local rancher's wife, unborn child, killed in highway accident." Below it, a photograph showed a younger Jackson, his face ravaged by grief so profound it seemed to radiate from the newsprint itself. The article detailed how Sarah Cole, 6 months pregnant with their first child, had been killed instantly when a drunk driver ran a red light on her way home from a doctor's appointment. Emma's hands trembled as she read the devastating details. The accident had occurred 15 years ago, just 3 days before Christmas. Sarah had been returning from what should have been a joyful visit to confirm the baby's healthy development. The drunk driver had survived with minor injuries while destroying Jackson's entire future in a single moment of selfish recklessness. "Please, Mika," Rosa whispered, her voice thick with concern. "This is not for us to see. Mr. Jackson, he keeps this pain locked away for good reason." But Emma couldn't stop reading, compelled by a need to understand the magnitude of loss that had shaped the man she'd come to care for so deeply. Additional clippings revealed the aftermath, how Jackson had withdrawn from community involvement, how he'd poured himself into building the ranch empire as if success could somehow compensate for what had been taken from him. There were sympathy cards from neighbors, legal documents from the wrongful death lawsuit, and most heartbreaking of all, a hospital bracelet labeled "Baby Boy Cole" that had never held a living child. Among the papers, Emma found photographs that showed the Jackson she'd only glimpsed in moments when his defenses were down. Pictures of him and Sarah laughing together at community events, his arm protectively around her growing belly, his face bright with the anticipation of becoming a father. The contrast with the guarded man she knew was almost unbearable. Here was someone who had loved completely and been completely destroyed by that love's loss. "How long have you known?" Emma asked Rosa, her voice barely above a whisper. "Since the beginning. I come to work here 1 year after, when he realized he cannot take care of this big house alone." Rosa's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "He was like a ghost then, going through motions of living but not really alive. Took years for him to become even what you see now." Emma felt pieces of Jackson's behavior falling into place with devastating clarity. His careful distance from emotional connection, his inability to attend community events, the way he sometimes looked at her with such longing, followed immediately by retreat. All of it made sense in the context of a man who had loved everything and lost it all in one terrible moment. The sound of boots on the front porch announced Jackson's return from his afternoon ride, and Rosa quickly began stuffing papers back into what remained of the box. But Emma found herself frozen, the newspaper clipping still in her hands, her heart breaking for the magnitude of pain Jackson had carried alone for 15 years. Jackson entered the study with the easy stride of a man comfortable in his own space, but his expression changed instantly when he saw the scattered papers and Emma's tear-filled eyes. His gaze fell to the newspaper clipping in her hands, and all color drained from his face as he realized his most carefully guarded secret had been exposed. "Rosa, you can go home early today," he said quietly, his voice carrying a control that cost him visible effort. Rosa gathered her things quickly, shooting Emma a look that carried both warning and compassion before slipping out of the room. The silence that followed felt heavy with 15 years of unspoken grief and the sudden collapse of carefully maintained boundaries. "I'm sorry," Emma said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "The box broke, and I couldn't help but see now." "You know," Jackson cut her off, his tone flat and defensive, "the whole ugly truth about why I am the way I am. Why I don't do relationships or community involvement or any of the things normal people take for granted." Emma set the clipping down gently and stepped toward him, her heart aching at the pain etched in every line of his face. "Jackson, I'm so sorry for your loss, but this doesn't change anything between us." Jackson laughed bitterly, the sound harsh in the quiet room. "Doesn't change anything. Emma, I lost my wife and my unborn son in one night. Everything I thought I knew about love and the future died with them. How can that not change everything? Because your pain doesn't define your worth," Emma said with quiet conviction. "Because surviving something that devastating doesn't make you broken, it makes you human. Because the capacity to love that deeply doesn't disappear just because love was taken from you." Jackson turned away from her gentle words, unable to bear the compassion in her eyes. "You don't understand. I should have been with her that night, should have driven her to the appointment, should have protected her somehow. Instead, I was here working on quarterly reports while my family died on a highway 20 miles away. The guilt that had poisoned 15 years of Jackson's life spilled out in raw confession, and Emma felt her heart breaking for the unnecessary burden he'd carried. She approached him slowly, as if he were a wounded animal that might bolt at sudden movement. "Jackson, look at me," she said softly, waiting until his tortured eyes met hers. "What happened to Sarah and your baby was a tragedy, but it wasn't your fault. A drunk driver made a choice that destroyed innocent lives. You couldn't have prevented it, couldn't have known it was coming, couldn't have done anything differently." "But I should have," Jackson began, but Emma gently interrupted. "Should have what? Been psychic? Had supernatural powers to see the future? Jackson, the only thing you're guilty of is being human in a world where terrible things sometimes happen. To good people." Jackson felt something cracking inside his chest. 15 years of self-blame meeting Emma's unwavering forgiveness. He'd expected her to run, to realize that loving him meant risking the kind of devastation he'd experienced. Instead, She stood before him, offering the very thing he'd been unable to give himself: absolution. "I'm terrified of losing someone." "Again," he whispered, the admission torn from his deepest fears. "Terrified of caring that much and having it ripped away. It nearly destroyed me the first time." Emma reached out to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his stubbled cheek. "Love always involves risk. But the alternative is spending your life only half alive, missing out on all the joy and connection that makes existence worthwhile. Sarah and your baby wouldn't want that for you." Jackson leaned into her touch despite himself, starved for the comfort he'd denied himself for so long. "How can you be so sure?" "Because love wants love to continue," Emma said simply. "Because the best way to honor what you had with Sarah is to prove that love is stronger than loss, that the human heart can heal without forgetting, can love again without betraying what came before." As Jackson looked into Emma's eyes, he saw not pity or fear, but understanding born from her own experience with grief and loss. She wasn't asking him to forget his past or pretend it hadn't shaped him. She was offering to love him as he was, wounded but healing, scarred but still capable of tenderness. "I don't know if I'm brave enough," Jackson admitted, his voice breaking with vulnerability. "You don't have to be brave all at once," Emma replied, her smile carrying infinite patience. "Just brave enough to take one step, then another, then another. Let me walk beside you, Jackson. Let me help carry some of that pain you've been bearing." Alone, as evening light filtered through the study windows, Jackson felt something he'd thought permanently broken beginning to mend. Emma's love didn't demand that he forget his past or risk more than he could bear. It simply asked him to believe that healing was possible, that the future could hold beauty again, without dishonoring what he'd lost. For the first time in 15 years, Jackson allowed himself to imagine tomorrow with hope, instead of mere endurance. In the days following Emma's discovery of his secret, Jackson found himself suspended between terror and hope, existing in a liminal space where 15 years of carefully constructed walls met the possibility of genuine healing. The revelation had stripped away his ability to maintain emotional distance, leaving him vulnerable in ways that both thrilled and terrified him. Each morning brought internal battles between the part of him that wanted to retreat into familiar isolation and the growing part that yearned for the connection Emma offered. The letter he'd never sent sat in his desk drawer, written in the desperate months after Sarah's death, when grief had driven him to seek impossible communication with the woman he'd lost. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "I don't know how to live in a world without you." The pages that followed documented his journey through the darkest valley of human experience, his struggle to find meaning in continued existence when everything that mattered had been taken away. Now, with Emma's gentle presence transforming his understanding of what the future might hold, Jackson found himself returning to that unsent letter with different eyes. What had once been a catalogue of despair now read like preparation for release, a necessary accounting of his pain before he could begin the work of healing. Emma, meanwhile, had thrown herself into ranch work with renewed purpose, as if understanding that Jackson needed time to process their changed dynamic without pressure. She moved through her daily routines with the same gentle competence, but her eyes held new depths of compassion whenever they encountered each other across the span of his internal struggle. "You're different," Tommy observed one morning as they worked together to repair storm damage from the previous night's wind. "Lighter, somehow, like you've set down something heavy you've been carrying." Jackson considered the foreman's words as they secured loose roofing on the equipment barn. Tommy had been with the ranch long enough to remember the early days after Sarah's death, when Jackson had been more ghost than man, going through the motions of life without any genuine engagement. If Tommy could see the change, it meant Jackson's transformation was becoming visible to others, a prospect both encouraging and unnerving. "Emma knows," Jackson said finally, the words emerging with surprising ease. "About Sarah and the baby." Tommy's hands stilled on the hammer he'd been using. "How's that sitting with you?" "Terrifying," Jackson admitted with dark humor. "Also, relieving. 15 years of hiding that pain has been exhausting." "Emma's good people," Tommy said carefully. "The kind who sees broken things and wants to help fix them, not throw them away." Jackson nodded, appreciating Tommy's understated wisdom. The foreman had a gift for saying exactly what needed to be heard without overcomplicating the message. That evening, Jackson made a decision that would have seemed impossible just weeks before. He walked to the bunkhouse where Emma was reading by lamplight, her presence creating an atmosphere of peace that drew him like a beacon. She looked up from her book with a smile that conveyed both welcome and patience, understanding that he was struggling with momentous internal changes. "Walk with me?" Jackson asked, gesturing toward the moonlit landscape that stretched beyond the ranch buildings. Emma rose without hesitation, pulling on her coat as they stepped into the crisp night air. The November sky blazed with stars unobscured by city lights, creating a canopy of infinite beauty above the snow-dusted rangeland. Their breath formed small clouds as they walked in comfortable silence toward the ridge where Jackson often went to think. "I've been carrying around a letter for 15 years, Jackson said as they reached his favorite overlook. "Written to Sarah in those first terrible months. Never sent it, obviously, but couldn't bring myself to throw it away either." Emma waited without speaking, understanding that this confession was leading somewhere important. Reading it now, I realize it was never really for her. It was for me, a way of processing grief that felt too big to hold alone. Jackson's voice carried the weight of hard-won understanding. "I think I'm finally ready to let it go." "What does letting go look like?" Emma asked gently. Jackson pulled the folded pages from his coat pocket, the paper worn soft from years of careful handling. "Saying goodbye to guilt. Accepting that Sarah would want me to live fully, not just survive. Believing that loving again doesn't dishonor what we had." Emma's eyes filled with tears that she made no attempt to hide. "Those are beautiful gifts to give yourself, Jackson, and to give her memory." They stood together in the starlight, holding the physical manifestation of Jackson's longest-held pain. The letter represented more than words on paper. It was the tangible symbol of his refusal to believe in a future beyond loss, his dedication to carrying guilt that belonged to no one. "Will you help me?" Jackson asked, his voice breaking slightly. With vulnerability, Emma took his hand, her fingers warm despite the cold air. "However you need." Jackson struck a match, its small flame bright against the darkness. Together they watched as fire consumed the pages that had held him prisoner for 15 years, the words dissolving into smoke that rose toward the infinite sky. As the last fragments turned to ash, Jackson felt something release in his chest, a loosening of bonds he'd worn so long they'd become part of his identity. "I loved her," Jackson said as the final embers died. "I'll always love her, but I'm ready to love again too." Emma's smile through her tears was radiant with hope and joy. "Love isn't diminished by being shared, Jackson. It multiplies." In the days that followed, Jackson's transformation accelerated, as if the letter's burning had removed a dam that had been holding back years of suppressed emotion. He found himself laughing at Tommy's jokes, taking genuine interest in the ranch hand's stories, even considering Martha's invitation to the community's Christmas celebration, something he'd avoided for 15 years. The business challenges that had seemed so overwhelming in recent months resolved themselves with surprising ease once Jackson approached them with renewed energy and clarity. The Riverside Development Project, which had felt like just another profitable venture, now excited him as an opportunity to create something meaningful for future generations. Even his relationship with the land itself felt renewed, as if seeing it through Emma's appreciative eyes had restored his connection to its beauty and significance. "The whole county's talking about you two," Martha mentioned during one of their business meetings, her tone carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with speculation. Jackson felt heat rise in his cheeks, but didn't deflect the observation as he once might have. "Good things, I hope." "Hopeful things," Martha corrected with a knowing smile. "People have been worried about you for years, Jackson. Seeing you come back to life has been a gift to everyone who cares about you." The community's investment in his happiness touched Jackson more than he'd expected. He'd spent so long focused on self-protection that he'd forgotten how interconnected human lives could be, how one person's healing could ripple outward to touch others in positive ways. Emma's influence extended beyond Jackson to transform the entire ranch atmosphere. The hands worked with more energy and cooperation, as if her peaceful presence had reminded them that labor shared with goodwill was more satisfying than mere individual effort. Even the animals seemed more content, responding to the general sense of harmony that had replaced Jackson's previous emotional isolation. As December approached, Jackson found himself planning for the future with an enthusiasm he'd thought permanently lost. He began considering home improvements that would make the main house more welcoming, started thinking about expanding certain ranch operations, even allowed himself to imagine celebrations and gatherings that might fill the big rooms with laughter and conversation. The internal shift from survival to hope felt miraculous, as if Emma's love had awakened parts of himself that had been dormant for so long he'd forgotten they existed. For the first time in 15 years, tomorrow held promise instead of mere obligation, and Jackson found himself eager to discover what lay ahead. The morning of December 20th dawned clear and cold, with sunlight turning the snow-covered landscape into a crystalline wonderland that seemed to celebrate possibility itself. Jackson stood at his bedroom window, holding a small velvet box that contained a ring he'd chosen with more care than any business decision he'd ever made. Unlike the elaborate diamond he'd given Sarah in their youth, this ring was simple but perfect. A single sapphire the color of Wyoming sky, surrounded by small diamonds that caught light like stars. The ring represented everything he'd learned about love through loss and healing. That true commitment wasn't about grand gestures or expensive symbols, but about choosing each day to walk through life together, supporting each other through whatever storms might come. Emma had taught him that love could be both profound and simple, enduring and everyday, sacred without being solemn. Jackson had spent the previous evening in town, ostensibly on business, but actually seeking counsel from Father Rodriguez at St. Mary's Catholic Church. The priest, who had known Jackson since childhood and had conducted Sarah's funeral, listened with infinite patience as Jackson struggled to articulate his fears about loving again. "You honor Sarah's memory not by refusing to love, but by proving that love survives even death," Father Rodriguez had said in his gentle way. "She would want you to be happy, to share your life with someone who brings you joy. That's what love does. It wants the beloved to flourish." Now, as Jackson prepared for what he hoped would be the most important conversation of his adult life, those words provided comfort and courage. He'd asked Emma to meet him at the ridge where they'd burned his letter to Sarah, a location that had become sacred ground in their relationship, the place where his past and future had finally made peace with each other. Emma arrived as the sun reached its zenith, her cheeks flushed from the cold ride and her eyes bright with curiosity about Jackson's mysterious request. She'd sensed something different in his manner over the past few days, a purposefulness that suggested important decisions brewing beneath his newfound openness. "Beautiful day for a ride," Emma said, dismounting from her horse with the fluid grace that never failed to catch Jackson's attention. "Though I suspect this isn't really about enjoying the weather." Jackson felt his heart rate accelerate as he helped her down, his hands lingering on her waist longer than strictly necessary. 3 months ago, such casual intimacy would have been impossible for him. Now it felt natural, necessary, like breathing. "Emma," he began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he wanted to say. How did one compress a lifetime of longing and 15 years of healing into words adequate to the moment? Emma waited with characteristic patience, her understanding eyes encouraging him to take whatever time he needed. She'd learned to read his emotional rhythms, knowing when to offer gentle pressure and when to simply be present while he found his way to difficult truths. "Before you came here, I thought my life was complete," Jackson said finally, his voice carrying the weight of profound realization. Successful ranch, financial security, respect in the community. I told myself that was enough, that wanting more was asking for trouble. The wind carried the scent of snow and pine across the ridge, creating a backdrop of pristine beauty for words that would reshape both their futures. Emma's attention was absolute, her entire being focused on receiving whatever gift Jackson was preparing to offer. But complete isn't the same as fulfilled, Jackson continued, gaining strength from Emma's encouraging presence. Complete is just functional. What you've given me is the chance to be whole again, to remember what it feels like to wake up eager for the day instead of just resigned to it. Emma's eyes filled with tears that she made no attempt to hide, understanding that Jackson was building toward something momentous that would require all his courage to voice. "I know I'm not an easy man to love," Jackson said, his voice breaking slightly with vulnerability. "I come with baggage and scars and 15 years of learning to live defensively. I may never be as carefree as I was in my 20s, may always carry shadows from what I've lost." "Jackson," Emma said softly, "we all carry scars. What matters is how we choose to let them shape us, into people who are bitter and closed, or people who are deeper and more compassionate. Your scars have made you more beautiful, not less." Her words gave Jackson the final push he needed to take the leap that had been building for weeks. Reaching into his coat pocket, he withdrew the velvet box, his hands surprisingly steady despite the magnitude of the moment. "Emma Hartwell," he said, dropping to one knee in the snow, "would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" The question hung in the crystalline air between them, carrying 15 years of loneliness and 3 months of growing hope, the weight of carefully rebuilt trust and the promise of shared tomorrows. Emma's sharp intake of breath was the only sound in the vast landscape, as if even the wind had paused to await her answer. Jackson opened the box to reveal the sapphire ring, its blue depths catching sunlight and throwing it back in brilliant flashes. "I know it's not much compared to what a woman like you deserves, but it's perfect," Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's absolutely perfect." She knelt in the snow beside him, her hands framing his face as tears of joy streamed down her cheeks. "Yes, Jackson Cole. Yes, I'll marry you. I'll stand beside you through whatever comes. I'll help you remember how to be happy. I'll love you for exactly who you are." Jackson slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that trembled with relief and overwhelming gratitude. The simple band looked exactly right on Emma's hand, as if it had been waiting its entire existence for this moment, this woman, this promise of shared future. They held each other in the snow as the sun reached its peak overhead, two people who had found their way through loss and loneliness to discover that love really could heal even the deepest wounds. Jackson felt 15 years of careful control dissolving into tears he didn't try to hide, emotion so pure and powerful it swept away every defense he'd built against feeling too much. "I love you," he said against Emma's hair, the words emerging like a prayer of thanksgiving. "I love you more than I thought I'd ever be able to love anyone again." "I love you too," Emma replied, her voice carrying the absolute certainty that had marked every step of their relationship. "I love the wounded man who needed healing, and I love the whole man you're becoming. All of you, Jackson, all of you." As they stood together on the ridge, where Jackson had finally released his past, the future stretched ahead of them, bright with possibility. The ranch below looked like a promise waiting to be fulfilled, the mountains beyond like guardians blessing their union. They had found each other across the vast distances of grief and geography, two souls recognizing their perfect complement in each other's hearts. The ring caught fire in the afternoon light, throwing rainbow sparks that seemed to celebrate the miracle of second chances and the enduring power of love to transform even the most carefully guarded heart. The wedding took place on Christmas Eve, a date chosen not for its convenience but for its symbolism. The celebration of hope born into darkness of divine love, made manifest in humble circumstances. Emma had suggested the timing, understanding that Jackson needed to reclaim December as a month of joy rather than sorrow, to transform the season that had once brought his greatest loss into the time of his greatest happiness. The ceremony was held in the living room of the main house, before the massive stone fireplace where flames danced like celebration itself. Father Rodriguez had agreed to perform the service despite the unconventional venue, understanding that Jackson and Emma's love story had been too deeply rooted in this land to be properly blessed anywhere else. The family Bible that had belonged to Jackson's great-grandmother sat open on the mantel, ready to record their union alongside 3 generations of Cole family marriages. Emma wore her grandmother's simple white dress, altered by Rosa's skilled hands to fit perfectly while preserving its vintage elegance. The dress spoke of continuity and family blessing, of love that transcended generations and circumstances. In her hair, she wore wildflowers that Tommy had somehow managed to find, even in December's grip, their delicate beauty a reminder that life persists even in the harshest seasons. Jackson stood beside her in his grandfather's wedding suit, carefully preserved and tailored to fit his broader shoulders. The vintage black wool carried the weight of family tradition, while the modern cut acknowledged that this was a new chapter in the Cole family story. On his chest, he wore his great-grandfather's pocket watch, its steady, ticking a reminder that time, which had once seemed his enemy, had ultimately brought him this moment of perfect happiness. The guest list was small, but meaningful. Tommy and Rosa, who had become surrogate family to both bride and groom. Martha Coulson, whose friendship had sustained Jackson through his darkest years. Dr. Martinez, who had witnessed Jackson's transformation through his treatment of the animals. And a handful of ranch hands who had watched Emma's gentle presence work miracles in their midst. "Dearly beloved," Father Rodriguez began, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent blessing human hopes and fears. "We are gathered here in the sight of God and this company to join Jackson and Emma in holy matrimony. Marriage is not a contract to be entered lightly, but a covenant to be treasured deeply, a promise to walk together through whatever seasons life may bring." Jackson felt Emma's hand steady in his, her presence grounding him in this moment that felt both surreal and absolutely right. 3 months ago, he would have sworn that such happiness was impossible for him, that his capacity for joy had died on a highway 15 years past. Now, looking into Emma's radiant face, he understood that the human heart's ability to heal was one of God's greatest miracles. "Jackson," Father Rodriguez continued, "do you take Emma to be your lawfully wedded wife, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jackson replied, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "With all my heart, I do." "Emma, do you take Jackson to be your lawfully wedded husband, to love and to cherish, in sickness and in health, in prosperity and adversity, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Emma answered, her voice bright with joy and unwavering commitment. "Completely and forever I do." The exchange of rings was conducted with the reverence appropriate to sacred promises. Jackson's wedding band was new, but designed to complement Emma's engagement ring, both crafted by a local artisan who understood that some symbols required personal touch rather than mass production. As they slipped the rings onto each other's fingers, Jackson felt the final walls around his heart dissolve completely, replaced by a love so vast and certain it seemed to expand his very capacity for existence. By the power vested in me by God, in the state of Wyoming, Father Rodriguez announced with evident joy, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jackson, you may kiss your bride. The kiss that sealed their union was tender and profound, tasting of tears and laughter, of sorrow, transformed into joy, of two souls recognizing their perfect complement in each other. Around them, their small congregation erupted in applause and tears, witnessing the miracle of love triumphant over loss, hope victorious over despair. Rosa had prepared a wedding feast that filled the dining room with the aromas of celebration, roasted beef from the ranch's own cattle, vegetables from the winter garden, and a cake decorated with fondant wildflowers that matched Emma's bouquet. The meal became a communion of gratitude, each dish prepared with love and received with appreciation for the journey that had brought them all to this moment. To Jackson and Emma, Tommy said, raising his glass in the first toast, may your love be modern enough to survive the times and old-fashioned enough to last forever. Martha followed with her own blessing, to second chances and patient hearts, to love that heals and hope that endures. May you find in each other everything you've been seeking. As evening deepened and their guests departed into the starlit winter night, Jackson and Emma found themselves alone before the dying fire, still wearing their wedding clothes but with shoes kicked off and formality relaxed into intimate comfort. The family Bible now bore their names in Rosa's careful script, permanently recording their union alongside the generations who had come before. Mrs. Cole, Jackson said, testing the sound of Emma's new name with obvious pleasure. Mr. Cole, Emma replied, her smile radiant with contentment. I like the sound of that. They sat together in comfortable silence, watching flames flicker behind the fireplace screen, both overwhelmed by the magnitude of the day and the promise of all the days to come. The great house that had felt so empty for so many years now thrummed with the energy of new beginnings, ready to shelter another generation of love and laughter. Are you happy? Jackson asked, the question carrying the vulnerability of someone who had learned that happiness was not guaranteed but must be carefully tended and deeply appreciated. Emma turned to face him fully, her eyes bright with tears of pure joy. I'm so happy I can barely contain it. Are you? Jackson considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, taking inventory of emotions he was still learning to trust. Happier than I ever thought I'd be again, happier than I knew was possible. Outside, snow began to fall again, each flake catching the light from their windows like tiny stars blessing their union. Inside, two people who had found their way through loss and loneliness to perfect love began the first night of their shared forever, surrounded by the peace that comes from knowing that some promises are meant to last beyond time itself. 1 year later, the Cole Ranch bloomed with life in ways that extended far beyond the natural cycles of grass and cattle. The October morning sun painted the landscape in shades of gold and amber, illuminating changes both visible and profound that had transformed not just the physical property, but the very spirit of the place. Jackson stood on the same porch where he'd once measured success in quarterly reports and profit margins, now seeing abundance through Emma's appreciative eyes. Abundance that couldn't be quantified in financial statements. The oak tree they had planted together on their first anniversary stood near the main house, its young branches reaching toward the sky with the same hope that had marked their union. Though still small, the sapling represented everything they were building together. Roots deep enough to weather storms, growth steady enough to last generations, beauty that would increase with time. Emma had chosen an oak for its longevity and strength, understanding that some symbols needed to match the permanence of the promises they represented. It's going to be magnificent someday, Emma said, joining Jackson on the porch with 2 steaming cups of coffee, her movements carrying the comfortable grace of someone completely at home in her surroundings. Marriage had only deepened her natural contentment adding layers of security and shared purpose to her already peaceful disposition. Jackson accepted his coffee with a kiss that had become as natural as breathing, their easy affection a daily reminder of love's power to transform ordinary moments into small celebrations. Like everything else you've brought to this place, beautiful from the beginning, but growing more so with time. The year of marriage had been marked not by dramatic events, but by the accumulation of small joys that created a life worth celebrating. Emma had turned the formal dining room into a space where laughter was more common than silence, where ranch hands felt welcome to share meals and stories, where business discussions were seasoned with genuine care for the people involved. The kitchen had become the true heart of the house, filled with the aromas of Emma's cooking and the sound of easy conversation. Jackson's business ventures had prospered beyond his most optimistic projections, but success felt different now. Less like armor against an uncertain world, and more like stewardship of resources that could benefit others. The Riverside Development Project had evolved under Emma's gentle influence into a model community that preserved the area's natural beauty while providing affordable housing for young families. Martha often joked that Jackson's romantic happiness had made him an even shrewder businessman. Though she suspected the truth was simpler, contentment had freed him to think beyond mere profit. "Tommy wants to talk to us about expanding the breeding program," Emma mentioned, settling into the chair that had become hers by custom and comfort. "Says we've got the best genetic lines in 3 states, and people are starting to take notice." Jackson nodded, pleased by the recognition, but more interested in the collaborative us that had become natural in their business discussions. Emma's insights had proven invaluable in areas he'd never expected. Her intuitive understanding of animal behavior had led to improvements in their breeding selections, while her gift for reading people had helped him navigate several tricky negotiations with more grace than his previous blunt approach. The sound of children's laughter drifted across the morning air, announcing the arrival of Sarah's brother David and his family for their monthly visit. The nephew, who had drawn the crayon picture 15 years ago, was now 22 and engaged to a lovely girl who shared Emma's gift for bringing out the best in people. The family visits that Jackson had once endured out of obligation had become highlights he genuinely anticipated, opportunities to reconnect with the joy he'd forgotten he was capable of experiencing. "Uncle Jackson," called David's youngest daughter, a 7-year-old bundle of energy named Katie, who had claimed Emma as her favorite new aunt within minutes of their first meeting. "Aunt Emma promised to teach me how to braid horsetails." Emma laughed, rising to greet the child with the warm embrace that had made her instantly beloved by the entire extended family. "After breakfast, sweetheart. Can't do proper horse braiding on an empty stomach." Jackson watched the interaction with the profound gratitude that had become his default emotional state. Gratitude for second chances, for love that healed old wounds, for the way Emma had restored not just his capacity for happiness, but his connection to family and community. The little girl who clung to Emma's hand represented the future he'd thought lost forever. The sense of generational continuity that gave life meaning beyond individual success. David approached with his characteristic, easy smile, now tinged with the respect that comes from witnessing genuine transformation. He'd known Jackson before Sarah's death, remembered the laughing man who had been destroyed by tragedy and slowly rebuilt himself into someone harder but more isolated. Emma's influence had restored something David had thought permanently lost: his brother-in-law's ability to find joy in simple pleasures. "You look good, Jackson," David said, the simple words carrying years of concern and relief. "Both of you look good together." The observation was accurate in ways that extended beyond physical appearance. Jackson and Emma moved together with the synchronization of people who had learned to anticipate each other's needs, to support each other's strengths, to compensate gently for each other's occasional weaknesses. Their partnership had the quality of a well-rehearsed dance, natural and graceful, despite being newly learned. Over breakfast in the sunlit kitchen, conversation flowed with the easy warmth that had become characteristic of gatherings at the Cole Ranch. Emma's influence had transformed not just Jackson, but the entire atmosphere of the place, creating an environment where people felt safe to be themselves, to share their genuine thoughts and feelings without fear of judgment or manipulation. "Remember when you used to eat breakfast alone in that formal dining room?" David's wife Sarah, named for her husband's sister but possessing her own gentle strength, asked with affectionate teasing. "Emma's civilized you properly." Jackson laughed, a sound that had become common enough to no longer surprise those who heard it. "She's done more than civilize me. She's reminded me how to live instead of just existing." The conversation was interrupted by Rosa's arrival, her arms laden with supplies for the day's cooking, and her face bright with the satisfaction of someone whose prayers had been answered beyond her wildest hopes. She'd watched Jackson's transformation with maternal pride, understanding that her years of patient care had been vindicated by his return to happiness. "Mrs. Emma," Rosa said, using the title that had evolved naturally from respect and affection, "I brought the ingredients for your grandmother's apple cake. Little Katie has been asking for it since last visit." Emma rose to help with the groceries, their easy cooperation another example of how love had multiplied throughout the ranch community. Rosa's own family had been embraced by Jackson and Emma, their children finding summer work on the ranch, their celebrations shared by the entire extended Cole family. As the day progressed through its familiar rhythms of ranch work and family time, Jackson found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment of profound contentment. 15 years ago, he'd been certain that his capacity for happiness had died with Sarah and their unborn child. The man he'd become in the aftermath, successful but isolated, wealthy but emotionally impoverished, had seemed like the best he could hope for. Emma's arrival had changed everything, not through dramatic gestures or forced healing, but through the patient application of love and understanding. She'd seen past his defensive walls to the wounded heart beneath, offering not pity, but partnership, not solutions, but companionship on the journey toward wholeness. That evening, as their guests departed and the ranch settled into peaceful quiet, Jackson and Emma walked hand in hand to their oak tree, now showing the first signs of autumn color in its young leaves. The tree had grown visibly in its first year, its roots extending deeper into Wyoming soil, its branches reaching higher toward the endless sky. "What are you thinking about?" Emma asked, noting the reflective expression that still sometimes crossed Jackson's features during quiet moments. "How different everything is from what I expected," Jackson replied, his voice carrying wonder rather than regret. "A year ago, I thought success meant having enough money to feel secure and enough distance to avoid being hurt again. Now I understand that real success is having someone to share it all with. The joys and sorrows, the ordinary days, and the special moments." Emma squeezed his hand, her touch conveying the same steady love that had transformed his understanding of what life could offer. Love multiplies everything. The happiness becomes brighter, the challenges become manageable, even the simple pleasures become more precious when shared. As they stood together beneath the vast Wyoming sky, Jackson felt the truth of her words. In every fiber of his being, the ranch around them thrummed with life and purpose, the house behind them glowed with warmth and welcome, the future ahead stretched bright with possibilities they would explore together. He'd learned that healing didn't mean forgetting the past, but integrating it into a larger story of resilience and hope. Sarah's memory remained precious, but it no longer trapped him in a prison of guilt and isolation. Instead, it had become part of the foundation on which he and Emma were building their own legacy of love and partnership. The oak tree rustled in the evening breeze, its young leaves whispering promises of growth and permanence, of roots that would deepen and branches that would shelter future generations. Like their marriage, Like their love, like the life they were creating together, it was built to last beyond their individual lifetimes, a living testament to the power of two hearts joined in purpose and devotion. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jackson Cole knew with absolute certainty that he was finally, completely, and eternally home.